Good morning, Wolverines. How's everyone doing? Good. Well, I am super excited to be here because I get to stand here before you this morning and talk about two of my favorite topics in the entire world, comic books and me. So I'm going to start with me. I am a cartoonist, which means I write and draw comic books and graphic novels. I've been doing this for almost 20 years now, so for a really long time. Here are some of the comics and graphic novels that I've done during these past 20 years. About 4 years ago, I got involved with these books right here. How many of you have ever seen this show called Avatar: The Last Airbender? Okay. Now, if you did not raise your hand, you should feel a little bit ashamed because this is an amazing show. This is, to my mind, the best American-produced animated series ever. It ran on Nickelodeon from 2005 to 2008, and it was so popular that Nickelodeon decided to do the sequel show called The Legend of Korra, which wrapped up recently. Now, a few years ago, one of the editors at Dark Horse Comics, one of the biggest comic book companies in America, called me up, and she told me that Dark Horse had acquired the license to Avatar: The Last Airbender, and that they were going to put out a series of graphic novels that would fill in this 70-year gap between the end of the first series and the beginning of this new one. She asked me if I'd be willing to write these for them, and I jumped at the chance because I am a huge fan of that original series. Like I said, I've been doing this for about 4 years now, and the best part of this gig is that I get to call Mike DiMartino and Brian Konietzko, the two animators who created this show, and they totally call me back. It's awesome. It's like we're BFFs. So these three books are already out. The middle book, the one in white, tells you what happens to Zuko's mom. If you're a fan of the original show, you'll know that's one of the dangling threads that was left by that story. Just at the end of last year, the fourth book came out. This fourth book is called Avatar: The Last Airbender, Smoke and Shadow. And this book brings back Azula, who is Fire Lord Zuko's slightly insane sister. Now, these are not my only books to have come out recently. Last June, I became the head writer for Superman for DC Comics. I am a lifelong comic book geek, superhero comic book geek. I started reading superhero comics in the 5th grade. I'll tell you a little bit more about that in just a little bit. And to get to work on the very first superhero in the world ever has been an absolute thrill. Did you know this? Did you know that Superman is the very first superhero ever? What that means is every other superhero out there, Spider-Man, Batman, the Hulk, Captain America, they're all in some ways just carbon copies of Superman. The best part of this gig is that I get to work with a guy named John Romita Jr. John Romita Jr. is a pretty famous superhero comic book artist. He became kind of a fan favorite in the 90s when he was working on X-Men, Spider-Man, and Daredevil. And when I was in high school, I used to go to these local comic book conventions, and I would line up to get John Romita Jr.'s autograph. Now, he and I are partners on Superman. Life is just kind of crazy sometimes. And this is one of the ways in which my life got kind of crazy. So I do a lot of writing for other people's characters, like Avatar: The Last Airbender and like Superman. I also do writing for my own characters. So at the end of last year, another one of my books came out. This is called Secret Coders, and this is a book that I've been thinking about for a really long time. Before I became a full-time cartoonist, I was actually a high school computer science teacher. I taught computer science for 17 years, and I taught in this really visual way, so I'd end up drawing a lot on the board. Whenever I did this, I always thought, man, a lot of these lessons could really work well as a graphic novel. And last year, I finally got to do it. This is a joint project between me and a friend of mine named Mike Holmes. Mike, before he started working with me on this book, he used to work for a little property called Adventure Time. He did the comic book that was based on the TV series. He's an amazing, amazing cartoonist. If you look at his stuff, he has this real Saturday morning energy to all of his drawings that I just can't do. And together, we're telling a story that's kind of like Harry Potter. I'm sure you've all read Harry Potter before. In Harry Potter, this group of kids find their secret school. The secret school teaches magic, and they become wizards. Our book is almost exactly like that. In our book, a group of kids find their secret school. The secret school teaches coding, and they become coders. Now, in Harry Potter, there's a problem, and if you're a fan, you know this problem, and that is you read about these kids learning magic and becoming wizards, and then when you go home and you try those same things, you do not get to be a wizard. Our book does not have that problem. You read about these kids becoming coders, you go home and you try those same things, you also get to be a coder. So this is actually just the first of a 6-volume series. Thanks. This is just the first of a 6-volume series. The next one will be out in August. Mike and I are just incredibly excited about it. Now, for this talk, what I'm going to tell you about is how first I became a comic book reader, and then how I became a published cartoonist. So I am the son of 2 immigrants. This right here is probably the cutest picture of me ever taken. I was about 3 years old. It was a little downhill after this. But I'm the son of 2 immigrants. My mom was born in mainland China, my dad in Taiwan. They both came to the United States for grad school, met, fell in love, got married, and had me. When I was growing up, one of the primary ways that my parents and I interacted with each other was through storytelling. Both my mom and my dad loved to tell stories, and I loved listening to their stories. I think this is true of a lot of immigrant households, but my parents told me lots of stories from Chinese culture as a way of connecting me to this culture that they left. So I grew up surrounded by the Monkey King and by other Chinese mythological figures. I grew up loving stories. I also grew up drawing. My mom tells me that I started drawing when I was 2 years old, and I basically never stopped. So naturally, when you take drawing and stories and you add them together, you get animation. Animated movies, animated television shows, when I watched those, that was the first time that I realized that you could actually tell a story through drawing. When I was a kid, I loved cartoons. And when I was really little, in fact, my lifelong ambition was to work for this guy right here. You all know who this is? This is Walt Disney. In 3rd grade, our teacher made us do these biography reports. I chose to do mine on Walt Disney. And after that, I kind of got obsessed with him. I remember going to my library and checking out as many books about his life that I could find. I remember practicing drawing in that classic Disney style. I remember looking up in an encyclopedia. You guys know what that is? An encyclopedia? Okay, it's like Wikipedia, but it's on paper. So I remember looking up in the encyclopedia when he died, because I was hoping his date of death would match my birthday, because that would mean I might be his reincarnation. That did not work out. I even went to my local mall, and I went to the poster store, and I bought this giant poster-sized headshot of Walt Disney. Just his head. Like, not Disneyland, not any of the movies, just Walt Disney's head. I stuck it up in my bedroom. My friends would come over, and they go, "Why do you have this picture of a creepy old man in your bedroom?" And I'd have to tell them, that is not just any creepy old man, that is Walt Disney. So I really, really wanted to be a Disney animator. This all changed one night in 5th grade. In 5th grade, that was when I went from being just a regular nerd to comic book nerd. It happened this one night. My mom took me to our local bookstore. When I was a kid, at local bookstores, they had these things called spinner racks, and there were these wireframe racks that would carry a month's worth of comics, and you could spin them so that you could see them all. I'm pretty sure before this night, I'd seen comic books before, and I may have even read them before, but for some reason, on this night, I saw this issue of Marvel 2-in-1 sitting on that spinner rack, and as soon as I saw it, I knew from the depths of my being, the core of who I was, that I wanted to own it. I don't really know why. You all know what Marvel 2-in-1 is? This is a series that they don't really publish anymore, but they take 2 of their characters that didn't normally hang out together and put them together to have some kind of adventure. So in this issue, it was The Thing and Rom the Space Knight. Anyone know who The Thing is? Almost everybody knows who The Thing is, right? He's a pretty popular character, part of the Fantastic Four. Anyone know who Rom the Space Knight is? Okay, just a few of you. Nowadays, you have to be kind of hardcore to know who Rom the Space Knight is. Time has just not been very kind to Rom the Space Knight. But he's a superhero that dresses up like a robot and fights crime in outer space. Like I said, I don't know why this cover captured my heart. Maybe it was the fact that these 2 characters look so different from each other. They just shouldn't be friends, but they kind of are. But I brought this up to my mom, and I said, "Mom, from the depths of who I am, I need to own this comic book. Will you please buy it for me? She took one look at this cupboard and she said, no, absolutely not. Those two characters look way too scary and they're going to give you nightmares. And she had a point because even though I was in 5th grade, I was still getting nightmares. So she made me put this back on the spinner rack. To this day, I have no idea what the story's all about. My mom instead bought me this. Even though I am the writer of Superman now, when I was in 5th grade, I was not a big Superman fan. Now, we all know why my mom bought this for me, right? Because Superman is basically every parent's favorite superhero. Unlike The Thing and Rom the Space Knight, he's not scary looking at all. He's actually kind of good looking. He always does the right thing. He never says any bad words. He doesn't punch anybody unless he really has to. And afterwards, he feels a little bit guilty about it. He flies around in this blue uniform, doing good. He's like this giant flying Boy Scout. Well, I brought this home, and I was kind of sad about it, but I still read it. And in this book, the atomic bomb drops in 1986. It's 1984 as I'm reading it. So the atomic bomb drops. It kills off almost everybody on the planet. The few remnants of humanity that are left, they gather themselves in these little societies that are pretty lawless because all the police are dead. So a group of men have to get together, dress up in medieval-style armor, and ride around this nuclear countryside on these giant mutated dogs to fight crime. They call themselves the Atomic Knights. Superman, being Superman, is one of the survivors. He teams up with these Atomic Knights, and they have this adventure together. And in the last few pages of the story, it's revealed that the whole thing is actually just a dream that somebody's having. But that did not stop this book from freaking me out. I stayed up nights thinking about this. I stayed up nights thinking about Superman, about mutated dogs, about the atomic bomb, and about comic books, about how this combination of words and pictures had done something inside my brain that neither words nor pictures had done before. Within a few weeks of buying this book, I went from being a comic book reader to comic book creator. And this is actually one of my favorite aspects of the comic book industry. That dividing line between who is a reader and who's a creator, who is a fan and who's a professional, is just very, very thin. And it's very, very permeable. If you want to become a comic book creator, all you really need are some pencils, some pens, and some paper. You go home and you draw a comic, and that's it. You are officially a comic book creator. That's exactly what I did when I was in 5th grade. I had this friend named Jeremy Kuniyoshi, this half Jewish, half Japanese kid, who at that point was like a veteran comic book geek. He'd been collecting comics since he could read. He had boxes and boxes of comics underneath his bed. And together, what we would do is, while our more athletic friends were playing rugby out in the field at lunch, we would sit at the lunch tables and we would brainstorm stories together. So we would both come up with a story. I would do all the pencils, he would do all the inks. Then we'd give our original art to his mom, who would take them to work, wait till all her coworkers went home, and sneak photocopies for us. Then we would take these photocopies, we'd staple them by hand, we'd sell them to our classmates for 50 cents a piece. We made like $8. It was amazing. All of our stories were about this character that we'd made up named the Spade Hunter. He was not a very original character. He's basically a Robin Hood ripoff. So he wore all green, he lived in the woods, he had a band of merry men. Our one innovation on this character is that instead of fighting with a bow and arrow, Spade Hunter had this discus of death that he would throw at people's heads. We thought it was awesome. So we sold these Spade Hunter comics, we made our $8, and when I was a kid, the Statue of Liberty was actually going through these issues. They would run these ads during cartoons talking about how her nose was about to rust off, and they would ask for donations for the Restore the Statue of Liberty Fund. Jeremy and I, we love America. So we decided to take our $8 and donate it to the Restore the Statue of Liberty Fund. Our 5th grade teacher was so proud of us that she gave us these McDonald's gift certificates that were worth more than $8. To this day, that is my best financial decision as a cartoonist. Now, Jeremy has since given up on comics. He is now a radiologist. He lives in this giant house in Hawaii. He makes so much money, he could probably buy me and my family if he wanted to. But I kept making comics. I kept making comics through the 5th grade, through the 6th grade. Now, in 7th grade, I had this friend. And this friend is better than me. He was just better than me in every way one human being can be better than another. He was better looking, he was smarter, he had a higher GPA, he was more well-spoken, he was more popular, he was more athletic, he had better clothes, he was just better. And one day, like this is how much better he was than me. Like in 7th grade, I could not get a girlfriend for the life of me. This guy had like 6 in a row, one after the other. So one day he sees me reading these comics and he says to me, if you keep reading those things, you will never get a girlfriend. And in 7th grade, I knew from the core of who I was that I wanted a girlfriend. So I took his advice, I gave up comics, I took all the money that I would have used on comic books, and I bought this instead. This is the 80s, and in the 80s, if you wanted to be awesome, you had to have a denim jacket. I also learned how to do this with my pants. This was called pegging. This is where you roll up the bottoms of your pants so that your legs look like these long balloons. And I've heard that this is actually coming back, which I think is kind of crazy. But I did this. I pegged my pants, I put on my denim jacket, and then I went to school, and I waited for the ladies to come. I waited through the 7th grade, through the 8th grade, through the 9th grade. In 10th grade, I looked myself in the mirror, and I just had to face facts. I said, this girlfriend thing is just not going to happen for me. So there I was. I had no comic books. I had no girlfriend. And I thought, I can do something about one of these things. So I started collecting comics again. And I started collecting with this fervor that I just hadn't had when I was in 5th grade. Here's some of my favorite comics when I was in high school. I loved the Hulk when I was in high school. When I was really little, I thought the Hulk was kind of a stupid character, right? Big, green, strong guy, always says Hulk smash, very uninteresting. When I was in high school, he was being written by this guy named Peter David, who I thought was kind of a genius. I still think he's kind of a genius. And what his innovation on the Hulk is he made him big, green, strong, and also super smart and a little bit evil. It was amazing. It was an amazing book. I was also really into The Spirit in high school. This is a reprint of a classic superhero story from the 1940s done by a guy named Will Eisner. Will Eisner is considered one of the godfathers of American comics because he was one of the first cartoonists to bring cinematic storytelling techniques into American comics. Beautiful, beautiful work. In high school, I was also really into Uncle Scrooge, which is probably why I couldn't get a girlfriend. Now, my parents watched me do this. So they watched me dive into this habit that I had given up when I was in junior high, and they were really concerned. They sat me down. They said, Gene, you are about to become an adult. You're about to go to college. What are you doing collecting funny books again? And I just didn't really listen to them. I kept doing it. I eased their concern somewhat by actually getting into college. I went to UC Berkeley. And there I majored in computer science and I minored in creative writing. Now, when I graduated from Berkeley, I looked at these decades and decades and decades of adulthood that were just stretched out in front of me. And I thought, I have loved comic books for so long. If I do not publish at least one comic book before I die, I'm going to die unfulfilled. Nobody wants to die unfulfilled. So I started researching. I started looking up information about how I could self-publish a single issue of a comic book. This was the mid-90s, and around that time, this little thing called the internet was just getting started. So I went on the internet, and I found interviews done by these very successful self-published cartoonists. Now, in the wider world, self-publishing has this stink to it. I'm sure you all know this. If you tell somebody you're a novelist, they go, wow, that's great. But then if you say you're a self-published novelist, they go, oh, so you couldn't get a real publisher, huh? In comic books, it is not like that. In comic books, self-publishing is a way of proclaiming your own awesomeness to the world. Because you're telling the world, not only are you awesome enough to write and draw your own comic, but you are also awesome enough to handle all of the business of getting it printed and distributed. In comics, there are plenty of examples of very successful self-publishers. Here are 3 examples. The most successful of which is probably the middle guy right there. How many of you have read Bone? Okay, almost all of you. Great book. Jeff Smith, the cartoonist behind that, is one of my heroes. Bone started off as a self-published book. Jeff Smith saved up the money, put it out himself. Eventually, he got so popular that he was offered a book contract by this company called Scholastic, one of the biggest book publishers in America. And when he signed that contract with Scholastic, he actually asked him to rewrite their contract so that he could continue to self-publish Bone. To this day, there are two versions of Bone. There's a color version put out by Scholastic and a black and white version that he puts out himself. I don't know this for a fact, but I think the reason why he wanted to keep self-publishing Bone was because Jeff Smith did not want to lose that proof of his own awesomeness. So I went online, I read interviews with people like Jeff Smith to see how they did it. I also went to websites like this. This is a small press comics fact. I think this is still around, but it hasn't been updated since the late 90s. But on websites like this, I got step-by-step information about how to self-publish my own comic book. I learned that it cost about $3,000 to do it. So over a summer, I took as many extra hours as I could at my job to save up this $3,000. I was working as a software developer at the time. I also learned about this foundation called the Xeric Foundation. I'm sure you've all heard of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. The Turtles started off as a self-published book. These two cartoonists, dirt poor, I think one of them was living in his mom's basement. They got together, they drew the first issue of Turtles, they put it out with their own money, they cobbled together just a few grand, put it out, and within 5 years, the Turtles had become this multimedia, multinational thing, this franchise with its own toys, its own cartoons, its own movies, and these two guys were multimillionaires. One of these guys took his millions of dollars and he bought a Sherman tank. He also bought the Batmobile from the Tim Burton movie. And then the other guy took his money and he created a nonprofit organization. This nonprofit organization was called the Xeric Foundation. For 10 or 15 years, they would give out grants to self-publishing cartoonists. This was the Turtles guys' way of giving back to their roots. I applied for the Xeric Foundation, and I got it. It was kind of an amazing thing. I still remember the day that I got it. I went to my mailbox, I pulled out this little envelope from the Xeric Foundation, and I thought, oh man, because I thought it was going to be like college acceptances. You'll know this when you're older, but when you're applying for college, if you get a little envelope back, it is bad news. If you get a big envelope back, it is good news. So I opened up this little envelope, and in there was a letter telling me that I was going to get $3,000 of Ninja Turtles money to publish my own comic. It was amazing. It was better than getting a girlfriend. That's how amazing it was. So the result of that was this. This was Gordon Yamamoto and the King of the Geeks, my very first comic that I did as an adult. It was a ton of fun to put this out. What it wasn't, though, was lucrative. I spent $3,000 of Turtles money to put it out there. I got maybe $700 of it back. Now, my parents watched me do this, and they were pretty tolerant. You know, they said, you've been obsessed with this comic book thing for a while now. It's good for you to get it out of your system before you move on to your regular adult life. Unfortunately for them, this did not get out of my system. I enjoyed the process of making and putting out my comic so much that I wanted to do it again. So I took that $3,000 of my own money that I'd saved up, and I used it to put out Gordon Yamamoto and the King of the Geeks #2. Of that $3,000, I made maybe $500 of it back. Then I worked for another summer, and I saved up another $3,000, and I used it to put out Gordon Yamamoto and the King of the Geeks #3. Of that $3,000, I made maybe $200 or $300 of it back. So I was, at this point, down several $1,000s. Some of it mine, some of it the Turtles. And I thought maybe self-publishing isn't for me. But I still wanted to make comics. So I moved on to what are called mini comics. Mini comics are basically what Jeremy and I were doing in the 5th grade. So if self-publishing has this losery stink to it, mini comics publishing, to the wider world at least, is losery beyond losery, right? Because not only do you not have a publisher, but in the end, you have like this Xeroxed comic. In the comic book industry, it is not like that at all. In the comic book industry, there's actually this thriving culture of mini comics. If you go to any comic book convention anywhere in America, there's going to be this corner there where people are making and selling and trading these comics. And often, the most innovative things on that convention floor are in that mini comics corner. Mini comics is like the punk rock of comics. If self-publishing is a way of telling the world that you're awesome, mini comics is telling the world that you are awesome beyond awesome. Because you're telling the world, not only are you awesome enough to write and draw your own story, not only are you awesome enough to handle all the business of putting that comic out there, but you could care less about money. So I started making mini comics again. My parents at this point were really annoyed. They'd call me up and they'd go, "Why are you doing this thing that you used to do with Jeremy when you were in 5th grade? This makes no sense to us. And didn't we hear that Jeremy is now in med school?" Well, I didn't really listen to them. I kept making mini comics for several years. And by the end of these several years, I had several hundred pages of comics under my belt. I really wanted these pages to be collected into graphic novel formats. Self-publishing a graphic novel is not a very easy thing. It takes a lot of money and a lot of work. So I felt like, maybe it's time for me to look for a publisher. So I went online. I went to the websites of my favorite comic book publishers. On all these websites, they have these things called submission guidelines where they tell you how to send your work in for consideration. So I looked at all these submission guidelines. I followed them all to a T, except for one of them. For my submission to SLG Publishing, based out of San Jose, California, I forgot to include a self-addressed stamped envelope. I sent all these submissions out, and over the course of the next 6 months, I got rejected in every way a human being can get rejected. I got rejected by email, by postcard, by letter, in person, over the phone. And by the end of these 6 months, I'd heard from all these companies except for one, except for SLG Publishing in San Jose, California. I waited for them for a year. And at the end of that year, when I didn't hear from them, I just thought, they must not have liked my comics so much that they didn't even want to spend the money on a stamp to tell me no. 3 years after that submission, I got a call from Dan Vado, the head of SLG Publishing. He said, that submission you sent a while back? Let's do it. And the result were these 2 books right here. These were essentially collections of the comics that I'd done as self-published and as mini comics. And these were my first 2 graphic novels. This was a ton of fun to work with SLG Publishing. Recently, the blue one sold out, so they've reissued both of these stories into a single volume called Animal Crackers. Now, this was a lot of fun, but it did not bring in a lot of money. With all 3 of these books, I made maybe enough to take me and my wife out to dinner. There's just not a ton of money in independent American comic book publishing. It was still fun for me, but my parents were extremely worried now, because they saw that I was having some success in comics, but the success was it wasn't bringing in any money. They were worried about how I was going to feed myself as I got older. Now, while all of this was happening, while I was working with SLG, while I was making the mini comics and doing the self-publishing comics, something very interesting was happening in the wider world. First, publications like the New York Times, Publishers Weekly, and Time Magazine, these really established magazines and newspapers, were starting to review comic books and graphic novels. 20 years ago, this was unheard of. Second, in 2003, 2 graphic novels hit the New York Times bestsellers list. One was Persepolis by Marjane Satrapi, an amazing book. You all should read it if you haven't. And the second one was In the Shadow of No Towers, done by a guy named Art Spiegelman, who's better known for his book Mouse, which was the very first graphic novel to win a Pulitzer Prize. Now, when these 2 books hit the New York Times bestsellers list, a lot of big New York-based book publishers, traditional book publishers, freaked out. Because up until this point, nobody thought that graphic novels could sell that well. So these big publishers started descending down into my world, into the world of American independent comics, with fistfuls of cash looking for the next New York Times bestseller. One of the people they approached is this guy right here. This is Derek Kirk Kim. I know he kind of looks like me because he stole my style, but we're 2 different people. Derek is an amazingly, amazingly talented cartoonist. In 2003, he did this book called Same Difference that won all 3 major comic book industry awards. And after this, all these big publishers started asking him for his next book. Derek is a great friend. So he introduced me to one of these publishers, an outfit called First Second, which is part of Macmillan, one of the big publishers in the world. I submitted to the head editor at First Second. They liked my submission enough that they signed me up, and I have been with them ever since. I've done a whole bunch of books with them. They're kind of like my current home as a cartoonist. This was a lot of fun. It was just as fun as working with SLG Publishing, but it was really different. And one of the big differences was in terms of money. I don't know if you know anything about traditional book publishing, but they have this crazy business model where they give you a chunk of money called an advance before you ever finish the book. Sometimes before you even start it, which I think is nuts. In independent American publishing, comic book publishing, what they do is, you finish your book, you submit it. If they like it, they put it out. And if there's any money that happens at the back end, you get a piece of it. I remember when my editor called me up and told me about this advance that they were going to give me, I didn't say it out loud, but I thought to myself, man, you could have just told me you were going to buy me a burrito, and I totally would have signed with you. So I was surprised, but I was not as surprised as my parents. When I told my parents that I was actually going to get paid some decent money to make a comic book, they were like, what? People are actually paying real money for little drawings? That makes no sense. The very first book that I did with First Second was called American Born Chinese, which came out in 2006. And it was much better received than I ever thought possible. It was amazing. It was life-changing. It opened all sorts of doors of opportunity to me. And one of these doors was into newspaper comics publishing. Now, I think even with the rise of the graphic novel, most people in America, when they think of comics, they think of things like Peanuts, or they think of things like Calvin and Hobbes. They think of newspaper comics, right? When I was in elementary school, I tried for about a week to do a newspaper-style strip, one strip a day, and I realized that I just do not have what it takes. For a newspaper strip, you have to be funny every 4 panels. That is a lot of pressure. I just couldn't handle it. So I gave up on the idea until about a year after American Born Chinese came out. The New York Times called up my agent, and they asked me if I'd be willing to do a story for them for a feature that they used to call the funny pages. This is where they would take a short story done in comic book format, and they would serialize this short story every Sunday for 18 to 20 weeks. I did a short story for them called Prime Baby, because nobody says no to the New York Times. Prime Baby is about a young boy, this 3rd grader, who gets this baby sister that he's very jealous of. So he tries to prove to his parents that she's actually an alien, so that she'll be taken away by the FBI. First Second liked this story enough that they have since collected it into a graphic novella. Now, on the very first Sunday that the very first page of Prime Baby came out in the New York Times, I got a call from my dad. My dad told me, he lives in Northern California. He told me that he had a hard time finding a copy of the New York Times. He ended up going to a local Starbucks where he paid something like $5 for it. That is a lot of money for my dad to pay for a newspaper. He's just kind of on the cheap side. But he told me that when he opened the pages of the New York Times and he saw my drawings in there, that he felt happy. So that is how I finally pleased my parents. Now, I have to tell you, I feel incredibly, incredibly lucky to be involved in graphic novels at this point, because I think, in America at least, we are going through a graphic novel renaissance, where many of the best graphic novels that have ever been produced in this country are being produced right now. So I would encourage you, if you are the kind of kid that has a hard time paying attention in class because you're going through plot ideas in your head, if you have characters that talk to you right before you go to sleep, I would encourage you to take that story and consider telling it as a graphic novel. Because we're going through this renaissance right now, we need as many different storytelling voices as we can get. So thank you very much for your time and attention. Thank you. Are there any questions that I can answer for you? Any questions that I can answer for you? Can I just have them? Can you talk really loud? Yeah, you can. Awesome. Go ahead. What's my favorite comic that I've read but not worked on? I have to tell you, I could give you a list as long as my arm. I really like Mouse, which I mentioned earlier. Mouse by Art Spiegelman, the first book to the first graphic novel to have won a Pulitzer Prize. I really also like Same Difference, my friend's book. You know, we're friends, but even if I hated him, I would still love his book. And I also like this book called Meanwhile by Jason Shiga, which is a choose-your-own-adventure comic. And it's all about time travel and math. It's really an amazing, amazing book. You should check that out if you haven't. I like this one, 100 Demons by Linda Berry, which is amazing. She's a comic book genius. Yes. Marvel or DC? Man, you're trying to get me in trouble. Okay, so I work for DC now, which makes it funky. But to be honest, when I was a kid, I definitely preferred Marvel. But that was because, like, when I was a kid, I just thought DC was stupid, right? I remember this is the moment that I turned on DC. Was I found out that they had a character named Aqua Lad. Like, Aqua is kind of dumb, but when you add Lad to the end, that just makes it ridiculous. And I just couldn't deal with it. Yes. Do I have any favorite webcomics? Well, so my friend Derek. So again, even if I didn't like him as a human being, I would still like him as a cartoonist. He had a webcomic up called Toon that I thought was brilliant. It's about a young man who gets kidnapped by these intergalactic zookeepers, and he's kept as the human exhibit in this intergalactic zoo. Really cool. Yes. So the question is, do I both write and illustrate all the comics that I work on? Some of the books, I just do the writing, and other ones, I do both the writing and the drawing. And part of that is because I'm a very slow artist. So if I were to draw all the books that I wanted to work on, I just wouldn't work on very many. And part of it is that I'm also very limited as a cartoonist. I have a very limited style, and there are certain stories that I want to tell that would fit better with other people's styles. Yes? Okay, so do I draw more on my computer or on paper? Up until now, all the big books that I've done have been a hybrid process. So I'll draw and I'll ink on paper, and then I'll scan it into the computer, and I'll do my I'll do my lettering and the coloring on the computer. But a lot of my younger cartoonist friends, like anybody under the age of 35, they all tell me that if you go all digital, you can go way faster. So I got a Cintiq. Do you know what that is? It's like a monitor that you can draw on. And I've been practicing on that. I'm still not faster than I am on paper, but I'm planning on doing my next big project with an all digital process. Yes? I'm sorry? What are my personal experiences in terms of writing? Oh, do they inform my writing? Okay, so the question is, do my personal experiences inform my writing? And the answer is yes. I think this is true for almost every author. But I would say even when I'm working on fantasy stories, even when I'm working on stories about other people's characters like Superman or Avatar: The Last Airbender, my own experiences are the core of what I draw from. So for instance, the very first book that I did, Gordon Yamamoto and the King of the Geeks, that's about a young man who gets a spaceship stuck in his nose, and he becomes friends with the alien that's driving the ship. Now that is built on personal experience. I have never had a spaceship stuck in my nose, but I have had a lifelong struggle with sinus problems. This might be TMI, but for some reason, one of my nostrils is always plugged up. Right now, it's the left one. So, one day, like the problem with sinus problems, if you have sinus problems, you know this, is that there's never anybody to blame. You're just kind of born with it, and you take pills and sprays and stuff, and it never really fixes it. One day I thought, what if there was somebody to blame? What if something sentient was plugging up my nose? And that's how that book came about. Yes? Who do I think is the most what? Respirating? Respirating? So you got to define that for me. So would you consider like Darth Vader respirating? Oh, okay. Okay, the most respirating superhero I would say is, he's not a superhero, but I'm going to go supervillain. His name is Stiltman. I think he is the most respirating superhero. I appreciate you adding that to my vocabulary, by the way. In terms of the best, I would still have to go with the Hulk. Just because of my childhood fascination with that character. Yes? Who's my favorite current Marvel character? It has to be Ms. Marvel, the newest Ms. Marvel. I think she's perfectly written. All the way in the back? Who would win in a fight, Batman or Superman? Are you asking me to predict the movie that's going to be coming out soon? Okay. I'll have to tell you this, and I'm saying this as a Superman writer. I don't want to be biased or anything, but I feel like after a careful, logical analysis of both of these characters, it is obviously Superman. Are you kidding me? Come on. Yes. Okay, so the question is, did I finally get the girlfriend? I got my first girlfriend. So I gave up the pursuit of the girlfriend in 10th grade. That's when I started collecting comics again. I got my first girlfriend the year after. So that thanks. So that friend of mine who was super popular, he was totally wrong. You can read comics and also get a significant other. Those two things are not incompatible, for sure. I will tell you this though, like when I first met my now wife, who was not my first girlfriend, I waited a while to tell her that I was involved in comics in any way, that I collected comics, that I made comics. I waited about 6 months. I wanted to be sure that she liked me before I told her, just in case. And it ended up being this great choice because when I told her, she was like, comic books, isn't that for like third graders? Why is a grown man involved in that? But then I eventually converted her. She is now a graphic novel reader, and I converted her with 2 books. I converted her with Mouse, first graphic novel to win a Pulitzer Prize, and I also converted her with this book called Why the Last Man. Have you heard of this? They may be making this book into a movie soon, but it's about this world where all the male mammals die in this one instant. All the male humans, all the male dogs, all the male everything, all die except for this one guy and his pet male monkey. So the women of the world have to figure out how to rebuild society without men, and this woman scientist tries to figure out by studying this guy what's going on, like why all the men died. I don't know why my wife likes that book so much, but she loves that book. She loves it. Yes. What's my favorite movie? You know, so what's my favorite movie? You know, I don't know if I have like an absolute favorite, but there are definitely movies that I like. So I'll tell you the movie that I like that I'm supposed to like, and then I'll tell you the movie that I like that sometimes my friends make fun of me for. So I really like The Avengers, the first one. I also really like Spider-Man 2, and I also like Notting Hill. I think that's amazing. That's an amazing, like I've watched that over and over again. I think it's a work of genius. Okay, last question right here. Okay, so the question is, how does working on Superman, which is in a shared universe, how does that impact my creative process? The short answer is, I do not get as much control, right? That Superman is probably the book that I have the least control on. But it's still a lot of fun because it's collaborative. I end up working with a team of Superman writers, and then every now and then we'll hear from our editor that something is happening in like Batman or in Wonder Woman that affects something in our book. So the way one of my friends, who's also working on Superman in a different book, his name is Greg Pak, great writer. The way he describes it is working on a modern superhero comic in a shared universe is a bit like improv. You know, like people will throw things at you and you just kind of have to incorporate in the story. But that's a really fun challenge in and of itself. Great question. Thank you all so much for your time and attention. It was great to talk to you all. Thank you.